Sunday School Teacher Workshop. So, continuing on with this section that's alliterated with these R words, the focus on this week being that of retribution, but as is the custom, I'm going to retitle this, rework that a little bit. So we're coming from 2 Kings 17, so of course for the last 2 weeks we've bounced around a little bit between Hosea and Jonah. Heads up as a warning, we're going to be venturing off into Micah. If I was a bit of a betting man, then I would say that's probably going to be the last and only remaining look we're going to get at the scroll of the 12, or minor prophets, unlike our last trip through the Gospel Project where I had all 3 years worth of lesson material to at least look at as far as the passages. I don't have that this time, so I really don't know what exactly is going to be in our next remaining quarter, but we have a lot of material left to go through as far as the Old Testament is concerned, even though we're kind of getting toward a bit of an end of the historical narrative, but we've not taken a look at any of the major prophets. There are several other books within the writings to look at, especially Daniel. And so, of course, we're going to have to get into some of the post-exilic writings as well. So here we're talking Zechariah, Haggai, Ezra, Nehemiah, and so forth. And so with all that, I would imagine if we do get another look at the minor prophets, it might be through one of those two, Zechariah, Haggai, that we'll get a chance to see. So hopefully part of what you've been focusing on the last couple of weeks with those minor prophets has not just been some of the central themes in that book, as important as they are, but also how that's kind of fit into the historical synopsis of where we are. Granted, Jonah and Hosea were prophesying at times that were farther removed from where we were in 2 Kings before. If you recall, a few weeks back when we were there, we were just kind of kicking around the story of Elisha. So there's a few hundred years between Elisha and those other prophets, and now we're getting to the end of 2 Kings here. With respect to the actual narrative of the northern kingdom's existence. And there's not much material left, and of course it focuses mostly on just the southern kingdom of Judah that remains until her captivity, and even that's hinted at in what we're going to be reading here. So, retitling this passage, Israel is judged, and in the process, the cosmos falls in decreation. Now, before we get into any of this, I would say, of course, in the 35 minutes that you might get on your standard Sunday morning. Of course, you know in your own class how quickly that time flies by and what all you can focus on. And if you're a bit more of a facilitator, if you're a bit more of a facilitator than you are one to just spit facts out and lecture, and I have to say I'm a bit more on the opposite side, and so there's good and bad that comes with either of those approaches. But certainly more time can get eaten up than you might have planned, and that leaves less time to necessarily talk about some of the things that you may have outlined for yourself that you would like to touch on if you had the time. And there's nothing wrong with any of that. But of course, either approach, you have to pick and choose what exactly are you going to talk about. And like most of these stories, there's way more information than you have time to cover in just that brief period of time. That being said, if you were to go through just what the text says and focus on the reasons why Israel winds up getting decimated as a nation, and God raises up the Assyrian Empire to be the hammer of his judgment, to do this very thing, there would not be anything ill or any time ill spent doing that. However, I would imagine many of your students as adults have probably already went through that part of the narrative themselves at least a few times if they've read the Bible through a few times, and of course have had it taught to them more than once. And so with that, focusing on the individual sins that are outlined there might be something that could perhaps be a bit more of a refresher that might not necessarily be needed. And you could perhaps take this time to broaden their horizons and understanding a little bit more about what's actually going on here, diving deeper into the biblical language. Because it's more than just a historical look at Israel falling and how the Assyrians were the facilitators that actually caused that. Instead, what we're getting here is a bookend to what started all the way back, well, of course in Genesis, but then as we see the patterns between Genesis and Exodus with the historical Adam, and then God raising up Israel as a nation from Abraham, birthing them from the womb of Egypt, bringing them to him at Sinai, and the repeated pattern of what happened in Genesis 1 and 2 in those events. And remember, we've talked ad nauseum about that. As we started this 18-month trip through the Old Testament, we've got those lessons, and just about every week I've tried to find a way to work that back into it so we can remember that Israel is a corporate Adam, and her job is to do the very thing that Adam was supposed to do in the garden. They are commissioned as a kingdom of priests, as much as Adam was coronated to be king and commissioned as priest in the garden, to represent Yahweh to all creation and to spread his glory and the wisdom of him to the furthest extent of all creation. So Canaan is now the new provincial Eden, and of course the tabernacle, and in this particular historical context and setting, the temple that's replaced it is the new Garden of Eden. Isaiah, who is a contemporary of Jonah and Hosea, who we talked about last week, and the week before that, is the one responsible for saying that God's house is supposed to be a house of prayer for all nations. So it was supposed to be the gateway that Israel were the stewards of, but instead of pushing people away by acting like the nations, they were supposed to be inviting people in by being faithful to Yahweh. And from the words of Moses, that if they actually did their job, that it would magnetically attract the nations to want to leave behind the religion of superstition and, of course, the demonic worship of false gods, to then come into right covenant relationship with Yahweh. So all that being said, when we walk through the story, what we're actually supposed to be picking up on here is that God creates the cosmos in Genesis 1, and then in a sense kind of reestablishes the cosmos when we get into the story of the book of Exodus and the events that occurred in that as well. So of course the stuff on the center column and the right side of the screen I can fly through rather quickly. I want to spend a little bit more time churning through the stuff on the left side of the screen so we can make sure we understand the significance of what has happened, so that when we get into the context of what is going on in this story, we can really see that there's way more here than just a grotesque, awful siege that no doubt cost many, many lives. If you know much about the Assyrians and how they handled battle, then when they conquered enemies, they were notorious for doing some extremely heinous things, such as impaling their enemies. And then, of course, they would even do things to the land that was reprehensible. They would sow the fields with salt, bring in massive boulders and lay them out in the fields. They would cut down all the trees. I mean, they wanted to leave their mark on the land so that every generation would know this was the handiwork of the Assyrians, and there would never be anything left to grow there, but it would just be a perpetual hellscape, essentially, for all generations left behind. So anyway, we're going to go back, spend a little time in the original Exodus story, but bounce around in a couple different passages, mostly here in Psalm 74. So I want you to pay special attention to that. So God created the cosmos, and notice I put this in quotation marks, when he redeemed Israel. So I'm not even starting with the creation story. What's happening in the redemption of Israel out of Egypt, again, is a retelling of Genesis 1 and 2, but not with just one guy and his wife or helper as the central focus of the story, but a corporate group of people who are the new Adam, right? So Psalm 74, this is what the psalmist says. Now, oddly enough, he starts off this psalm as a lament, asking God, how long are you going to forget about us? And he's talking about all the devastation that's actually happened to Israel. So this is likely a psalm that's written in exile. So here the psalmist is going to say, remember your congregation, which you purchased long ago. So of course that is that act of redemption when through the Passover, those firstborn males are now his, and he says every firstborn male must be bought back from me. So all of that was a redemption of the entire nation, right? And redeemed as the tribe for your own possession. Now this is invoking the very language here of Exodus 19 when he says, if you will be careful to obey my commands, observe my covenant, then you of all nations will be my own possession, even though all the earth is mine. So we can clearly see Yahweh redeemed Israel. He goes on to say in the rest of verse 2, remember Mount Zion where you dwell. Right? So when he says Mount Zion is the place that God dwells, we take into consideration here the fact the temple rests there. It's the house that Solomon built and dedicated to Yahweh, and through the prophets that spoke to both David and Solomon, that being Nathan, of course, and Gad the seer, this was what God promised. I didn't ever command anyone to build me a house made of cedar, but if the people will be faithful, then I will cause my name to dwell here forever. And God's name is an extension of him. So we can also appreciate from the larger construct that the Bible gives us that the temple, as much as the tabernacle was, and the Garden of Eden itself, of which the imagery in temple and tabernacle calls us back to, these are nexus points where heaven and earth come together. Isaiah 6 is probably the fullest representation of that, where Isaiah is in a vision and he sees God lifted up on his throne in the throne room of heaven, where he's surrounded by the seraphim, but the train of his robe is filling the very temple where Isaiah is standing, and of course it's the house that Solomon built, because the Ark of the Covenant is his footstool. So it's the nexus point where heaven and earth are together, right? So that's what it means to say that you dwell there. So God has established his holy mountain. I'm going to come back to this and focus on it just a bit more in a second. God, my King, is from ancient times performing saving acts on the earth. So with that, as God has redeemed this people, what is being referred to here is his saving acts, because he has created salvation for them. This is the crux of Moses' song by the sea in Exodus 15, when he says, God has become my salvation. And it's through that lens that the word salvation takes its meaning from that point on through the Old Testament, even into the New Testament. It's the end of exile. It's the beginning of Exodus. It's God always bringing out his people from darkness and ushering them into moments of new creation. Every time we see this, David using this word again in Psalm 18 and 2 Samuel 23, talking about his deliverance from Saul, and using a lot of that imagery of both the flood of Noah's day and the parting of the Red Sea in Moses and Israel's day, to talk about how God came down, condescended, delivered him from the throes of death and the threat that Saul was breathing out against him. So in doing all this, God has established his rule over his people. Notice this. The language here of verse 13 and 14, you divided the sea with your strength. This mythical kind of retelling of a story that comes from several other creation epics from different parts of the ancient Near East. You smashed the heads of the sea monsters, plural, in the water. You crushed the heads, plural, of Leviathan. You fed them to the creatures of the desert. First of all, let me dispel something. Leviathan is not an ancient dinosaur. I know that might be shocking to hear, but you cannot see this as some sort of swimming sauropod. And the reason is because it says heads. So with that, the imagery of Leviathan has always been a twisting sea serpentine dragon-style creature that's kind of like the ancient Hydra of the Herculean myth, right? That it has multiple heads, and this becomes a part of many creation stories. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation story, Marduk being the chief of the pantheon, the king of the gods, who defeated Tiamat, the twisting sea serpent in that story. He fillets her body in half, and he takes one half, and he creates the sky and the other the bodies of water on the land, because she is the chaotic waters that can turn herself into the form of a dragon. You also have the Memphite creation myth. So this is the story in which Ptah is the creator god. And while he doesn't necessarily do battle with a twisting sea serpent type of dragon, this is what Ra, the chief of the pantheon, so he's kind of like Marduk, does. His job is he goes into the silence of death every night, the underworld, when the sun sets, as he's the sun god. He has to do battle with Apophis, the worm that's attempting to try to basically swallow up all creation. And in many cases, it's depicted as a multi-headed dragon-style creature. Or, of course, what hits home all the more with this biblical literature is the Baal cycle, because Baal is the chief of the pantheon in Canaan, and, of course, has been one of the chief characters mentioned all throughout the stories of 2 Kings. So in the Baal creation myth or cycle, it's just like the Enuma Elish. You're just changing out Baal for Marduk. And instead of calling the sea dragon Tiamat, you're calling it Yam, which is the word in Hebrew and other Semitic languages for the sea. So it's the recycling of this mythical storyline to show that God is the one who brings chaos to order, like these other gods did. Now, at this point, you might be kind of swimming a little bit and wondering, what does this have to do with Israel's destruction at the hands of Assyria? So, we're getting there. What this author in Psalms is talking about is that very moment when, through two different empires, God has destroyed all of Israel, all of her holy sites, including the most holy, that being the temple, seemingly forgotten and abandoned them, but he has hope. not just optimism, but realistic hope grounded in not only the covenant, but the words of the prophets that God is going to bring them back. And he is inciting this remembrance by calling back to the moment when God founded them as a people. The whole reason why I'm bringing this up is because the way the psalmist is telling it is he is telling it like these ancient creation myths. That when God establishes Israel as a people, bringing them out of Egypt, he is giving them their origin story. Just like the Canaanites have the Baal cycle, just like the Babylonians have the Enuma Elish. The way these stories are crafted in Scripture is to show that God is the one who creates the cosmos at the time that he creates Israel as a people. Now, I know you might think, wait a minute, creation has been around long before Israel comes out of Egypt. Creation happens in Genesis 1 when there's nothing and now there's everything. Well, this is true. But again, we're not talking about physical creation. We're talking about spiritual creation. Now, as far as those old creation myths go, it's one and the same for them. The physical and the spiritual are all happening at the same time. But Israel is not a people at the beginning of creation. And Israel is an altogether new creation because she's a new Adam. It's a new creation moment. And so with that, God is doing the same things that all these other gods do. All of these other stories start off with first God creating the physical cosmos. And as he establishes the heavens, his throne room, then he creates humanity. And in creating humanity, they become his subjects. And in the process of that, he establishes the place where they are going to congregate and meet and worship. In Babylon, that happens to be the ziggurats, handmade, man-made mountains that are sites of sacred worship. In Canaan, it happens to be places like Mount Zaphon, Mount Hermon, Jerusalem. When Israel conquers Canaan, all of those sites are supposed to be destroyed, and in time, through David, God establishes Jerusalem as Mount Zion, the mountain where he will call first these covenant people, Israel, then the nations to come and worship. So, in these verses, Yahweh has brought order to the chaos when he destroys Leviathan, the twisting, multi-headed, serpentine dragon who represents the untamable chaos of the waters that God just simply walks on as if she's nothing more than an ant under his boot. And in doing this, Yahweh brings forth creation. Because he says, well, I missed this verse here in verse 15. You opened up springs and dry streams, and you dried up ever-flowing rivers, so God has brought forth creation. You established the moon and the sun. You set all the boundaries of the earth. I'm sure when we've read Psalm 74 before, what we've thought in that is that the psalmist is just poetically representing the idea that God's created everything. There's so much more in all of this. He's moving very quickly from story to story to story here, not really showing that God created his people, then he decided to make Zion his own, and then call back to creation when God actually parted waters for dry land to come about. He's telling the story of Israel's creation and the crushing of the heads of Leviathan and the setting of the boundaries of the earth and hanging the sun and moon all as one story. And that story is the moment Israel comes out of Egypt. You might be thinking, what are you talking about? Let me tell you. I'm referencing the moment when Israel crosses through the Red Sea. When Israel crosses through the Red Sea, what we're supposed to be seeing in that is that God is using that moment to crush the heads of Leviathan. There are other places, such as Isaiah, where that moment is referenced historically, and in that moment, Isaiah is stating very clearly that God was crushing the heads of the sea serpent Leviathan. So in God's moments of creation, this is what happens. He's bringing chaos to order that is symbolized through the crushing of the heads of Leviathan. The psalmist is talking about the creation of his people when God brought them out of Egypt, and that was defined as them going through the Red Sea. And in doing so, he destroys Egypt to bring them out on the other side. And then he covenants with them. He appears to them in the form of fire and smoke on Sinai, his holy mountain, right, where they are seated there to worship him. You see how all of this is coming together. And then he offers them the covenant that if you do, this is what I will do. And you will be my people, and your job is to bring everyone else to me because I want the worship of all the nations. And so, in doing so, the flowery, poetic language of him hanging the sun and the moon and setting the boundaries of where they live is covenant language that speaks to the idea that God has created the cosmos around Israel, that literally Canaan, that's now about to become Israel, is going to be the center of the known world where all of God's ordering and business is going to happen with this people blessing all the nations of the world. That might take a little time to chew on. I would love to chew on it more with you, but of course for the time that I have to move on to help you connect this to 2 Kings 17. So I do want to talk a little bit about what happens in Egypt with the plagues, because this is a moment when God is decreating Egypt. Now, if you listen to everything I just said, talking about creation myths and how their gods are responsible for creating everything from ordering the water, that's exactly how Egypt's creation myth, as far as the Memphite creation myth goes. Ptah starts with water, just like creation begins in Genesis 1:1 with the Spirit hovering above the water. And then he brings forth what's called the primordial mound, dry land. And it's on that he establishes the kingdom of Egypt, which is exactly how the entire creation story in Genesis 1 goes, with God capstoning it with dry land that's covered in vegetation, then animals, and then man. And then God meets with them, right? Ptah will go on to create humanity to ultimately serve him and the pantheon. So when God starts bringing these plagues out in Egypt, these plagues are not all aimed at one particular god, but rather groupings of gods. But there's a reason why. We have everything from the Nile turning to blood. I mean, why didn't God just send a firestorm? Why didn't God just send hellacious tsunamis, tornadoes, and hurricanes and earthquakes to literally destroy everything that was a physical standing structure in Egypt? Why the systematic devolution of the land through one plague leading to another plague and so forth, right? It's because this is what it is. It's the judgment against these gods, and it's the deconstruction of the ordering of how their world came into being, starting first with the Nile turning into blood. The Nile, of course, is the ultimate lifeline of the land, and it has multiple gods that are responsible for maintaining it, stewarding it, and making it do its job so that it fertilizes the land. And of course the next with frogs, gnats, and flies, and then eventually we get to the death of the livestock. So each of these insects, of course the frogs contaminating the land as they come out of the Nile and everything that they do, but these biting insects are ultimately destroying everything around when it comes to people and livestock, as they're constantly aggravating, which leads then ultimately to the death of animals, leading us kind of up to day 6 of the Hebrew creation story. Then you have boils that plague man. Then you have hail mixed with fire that destroys everything around that's standing up. That's vegetation out in the land, trees and whatnot, but of course standing buildings. Then you have locusts that come through like a horde, and they consume everything else that's still standing. Then you ultimately have darkness. Darkness that is supposed to be the last final measure when the land itself is plunged into a palpable darkness where no one can see, they can barely feel their way around, probably don't even move much in that 3-day period until the last plague comes, in which the death of the firstborn is to show that all the gods have lost their power. No one can ultimately withstand Yahweh. But it's also to show that the capstone event of every creation story is the creation of man, including that of the Hebrew creation story. The only difference is in all those other creation stories, humans are slaves to the gods. In the Hebrew creation story, humans are co-regents that rule with God. But nonetheless, that's where the creation stories usually converge or climax at. The death of the firstborn is the loss of the ability to control human life, and only God, of course, grants that. The gods of Egypt have no power to preserve it. The God of the Hebrews, of course, has all power to take it. So there's a lot more that I would like to say about this, but again, in the brief time I have, working from the 1st through the 10th plague, what we're seeing here is an ordered decreation of Egypt. Now, on the right side of the screen, here's where we are in 2 Kings 17, as far as the history of what we're reading, but I've actually chosen to use Jeremiah 4, which I think is a great parallel passage for you to use with this. Now, disclaimer, in Jeremiah 4, what Jeremiah is talking about is the actual destruction of the kingdom of Judah, because by the time he becomes a prophet, Assyria is actually no longer the dominant power. They've been conquered as an empire by Babylon. And by virtue of that, Israel has not been a kingdom for more than 100 years at this point. So you might think, well, why then choose Jeremiah 4? Because the same events are occurring. In either the case of Israel or Judah, we have different empires laying siege to capital cities after they've went on a long and drawn-out campaign of destroying all the other outlying cities, the capital city being the last prize. And of course, the Assyrian invasion of the northern kingdom of Israel really didn't stop there. Once they destroyed Samaria, they didn't just turn around and go home. As Isaiah would prophesy, this is going to be a flood that sweeps through the land, starting from the north, because that's where they have to come. They cross over the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and then they enter into the northern area, where we would call today the lower portions of Turkey, and then the upper regions of Syria and Israel or Lebanon. And then they wash through the land like a tidal wave. It's in those days when the northern kingdom is destroyed, Hezekiah is ruling over Judah. And he lost 46 fortified cities to Sennacherib, who came and laid siege to Jerusalem, lastly, to destroy it. And had it not been for the intervention of the angel of the Lord, who killed almost 200,000 soldiers in one night, Sennacherib would have easily swallowed up the city. We know that from where he taunts the people of Jerusalem through his messengers, Rabshakeh, Rabsaris, and so forth. So anyway, Jeremiah 4 is a way of still looking back at the siege of Israel and Samaria and seeing what was going on there. Jeremiah 4:20 all the way through 26. This is what Jeremiah says. Disaster after disaster is reported because the whole land is destroyed. Sometimes that gets rendered as earth. The whole earth is destroyed. It's the Hebrew word eretz, so it's more accurately translated land. But still, the idea from the lens of Genesis 1, if it's the whole earth here, is we're talking about everything that's important to Israel is gone. It's dead. It's decimated. The Babylonians have left nothing of worth because they destroyed the capital city. They burned God's temple. There is no hope left to be found in this land. They're deporting everybody out of it, leaving the absolute poorest of the poor. Suddenly, my tents are destroyed, my tent curtains in a moment, just gone, vaporized, as if a horde had come through like locusts and eaten everything in sight. Verse 23, he says, I looked at the earth, and it was formless and empty. Now, this goes right back to the creation story and the very words used there in Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, that the earth was formless and void or empty, right? So he's essentially saying that what God has done has taken everything in Judah, that entire kingdom, and of course Israel before it, and he's upended it to the point where now it's like it was back at the starting point of all creation. There's just nothing but complete chaos and destruction. So what we're seeing here is that if God hung the cosmos or establishes the divine and earthly order when he brought Israel out of Egypt, brought them to himself at Sinai, makes the covenant with them, and then grants them the blessing that comes from that. Just like all the rest of these creation stories, he has hung the moon and the stars. He has centered them in the midpoint of the cosmos because this is their land. Just like for the Egyptians, Egypt is their land. For the Babylonians, Babylon is their land. They are the center point of the story because their gods made everything for them, right? So that being said, to say that now it's all formless and empty, it's just to say God has done away with every bit of it. I looked to the heavens, their light was gone. What we can honestly assess here is that this is hyperbolic language. Clearly, when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem, it did not cause the sun, moon, and stars to cease to shine. But this hyperbolic language is as if to say the spiritual powers are no longer in charge. Obviously, Jeremiah as a prophet realizes that God has not lost control here. But stars or heavenly luminaries in these other creation stories are often representative of spiritual beings. And it's as if to say that God is no longer favoring his people because the light that would be shining from him is no longer focused on them. I looked at the mountains, they were quaking, and the hills shook. I looked, there was no human being, and all the birds of the sky had fled. So everything from vegetation gone, mountains are quaking, Birds of the sky gone. So again, we're looking at the multiple tiers of creation in Genesis 1. And finally, there's not a human being left because seemingly they've all been killed and captured by Babylon. I looked, the fertile field was a wilderness. All of its cities were torn down. So what we see in Jeremiah 4, in his way of talking about the disaster Babylon has brought upon Israel, the Assyrians upon the northern kingdom as well, is looking back at the plagues of Egypt, how God systematically decreated Egypt by dismantling the control their gods had over them in front of all the people, Hebrews and Egyptians alike. And now because Israel and Judah have become the Egypt of their story, God is dismantling them for the sake of saving the righteous remnant to ultimately restore them and bring them back. And that's where the story will pick up. Now, this sets up a lot of seedbed for what will come in the next quarter to help me be able to better explain to you. When we get to the events of Ezra and Nehemiah, yes, the people do come back, but there are a lot of key events that don't transpire there that tells us that God did not reestablish them the way that they were hoping. That will not come until Messiah comes. Because when Messiah comes, he will be bringing a new covenant, and it will reestablish the cosmos centered around God's people who are ethnic Jews and Gentiles, remnants of all nations who come together to follow Jesus as Messiah into the new creation as a new humanity. All right, that's a lot. Hope that's helpful. Don't feel too intimidated to talk about this. You can easily dilute some of this by pointing out some of the key highlights by what I've said. I've just tried to give you a lot of information to think on and work with, to work into your lesson as you perhaps see fit. So, any final thoughts? Any final questions?